Sorry about that. I had stuff playing somewhere else. um, so thank you for coming to my channel today. And today we're going to be talking to Erin about some unequally yoked marriages or interfaith marriages, however you want to classify it. So, Erin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Erin. I go online as like Exchristian Erin or Exxtian Erin. I'm mostly on Twitter. Sometimes come over to YouTube to be on other people's channels. I was a Christian. I was born and raised a Christian. Was involved in a couple different denominations throughout my life. I went to Bible college. I did missions work. I spent a good chunk of my time as a youth going to several different youth groups. And then about 2 years ago now, I started to have my major concerns, and I ended up deconstructing my faith and leaving. And I now identify as an atheist, and I started posting about it on Twitter, and that's where I've kind of met other people who've gone through the same experience, and people have asked me to come on their shows and talk about my experience before, and I just am here to continue doing that, and we're going to have a conversation today that I think has not happened as often as I think it should.
Yeah, and even as myself, as somebody who's not a believer, who was a believer when I was married, and have now walked away while my wife has stayed in the faith, this is something that I think is a important topic that needs to be discussed more, because I don't think just because you have different religious beliefs from somebody that you can't have a relationship with them intimately or just friendly wise, because I think this is an important discussion.
Mm-hmm. And I think we'll get into it, but it definitely is something that I think you don't even realize maybe coming when you start having your questions and your doubts about your faith, is whether you're with somebody who has a strong faith position, and what kind of things come up during that as you're deepening your faith, like what kind of tensions come up within your relationship. For a lot of people, those tensions become too much, and it end up, a lot of relationships do end up not working out. So I'd like to just be an example of somebody who has figured out how to make that work. My husband is still a Christian, so I'd like to talk a little bit about how we've navigated that.
Okay. So kind of, usually I do these things in like an interview style. This one, because it's something that you and I both kind of have some grounds on, I kind of want to do this more as an open conversation. So feel free to shoot any questions my way at any time that you have them. But
Sure.
So if you don't mind sharing, because this is kind of an intimate part of you. How did you go about discussing with your husband that you were no longer a Christian?
Well, I think part of why I want to share my story is because I did everything wrong. I think, like a lot of people, you don't realize that you're deconstructing or that you're about to deconvert from your faith in the moment. So for me, when it was coming up, all my questions, I tended to like ask him, and there's a whole big like umbrella thing going on here, because part of my faith that I was raised in was that I was under the leadership of my husband, spiritually and all these other ways. So when I started having issues, I was turning to him to kind of fix it for me. And so I didn't outright just say like, I don't believe this anymore. It started probably with about 6 months of me kind of badgering him for questions, and because he has a lot of knowledge about the Bible, and he does have some schooling in that. He has a degree in theology, so I spent a lot of time just digging and asking him for questions and answers, and then it ended up kind of being like this apologetics, counter apologetics, but in a really kind of unhealthy way, because he didn't see that coming necessarily either. So it was about 6 months of that, and it wasn't until I kind of realized that as I was deconstructing out of like the idea of biblical like marriage, biblical womanhood, I started realizing like as my beliefs change and I start to see him more as just like a human being, I also started to realize that he may not have all the right answers. He might not all be able to fix this for me. And so I sort of backed off a little bit and kind of turned my attention elsewhere as far as like venting, because I was venting a lot on him, and I think that was really unhealthy. And I think that was a key moment where I had to make a decision, and I think that decision ultimately changed the projection of where a relationship would go from there, because I stopped putting him on the hot seat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, because I did mine completely the bad way. Like, I think there's so many people that have done these conversations the wrong way, and I think just having people that can acknowledge that they've done things the wrong way and they're still with this person is kind of an important thing to let people know that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, do it the way that you feel most comfortable doing it, but understand that even if, you know, there's still a light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's dark getting there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I did mine was right after my grandmother passed away. I'd kind of been walking away from it, and shortly after my grandmother passed away, my wife was telling me, "Hey, we need to start going back to church and blah blah blah." And I was like, "No, I just don't think I want to do that." And she was like, "Why?" And I was like, "She was like, why? Don't you believe anymore?" And I was like, "No, I don't think I do." And this is like right around the time of my grandmother's funeral and stuff, and we were out at dinner with the family. And I was like, looking back at it, I was like, that was completely the wrong way to have that conversation. And it led to some issues, but you know, you just keep moving on and getting past them.
Yeah. So, yeah, that would be tough. And I'm sure that whenever it's something that happens, like surrounding an event, there's like it's quick for a lot of people to say like, oh, you're only having these, you know, these doubts because of this life circumstance that you're going through. I can see that it's tough. There's no, like you said, there's no perfect way to like go about this. I think there are some things that we can learn from each other on like maybe what not to do. So one of the things that I ended up doing, like I said, I was turning all my frustration towards the relationship and expecting him to fix it. And a big turning point for me was actually going to see a counselor, because I realized that I was like, I had kind of realized that I was not only kind of deconstructing some of the ideas that I had believed in, but that a lot of this pain was coming up from traumatic experiences that I had had in the church. So for me, going to see a counselor to like work on those trauma really like kind of de-escalated the what was going on in my house as well, because it didn't have to do with my husband. Some of the stuff had happened to me as a kid and as an early youth. So getting some proper counseling from somebody and realizing that I had some trauma, realizing that I needed to work through some of that trauma, helped me to much more calmly talk to my husband about where I was at with my faith.
So you said it's been about 2 years?
I think it's been about 2 years since I started the process.
Okay.
I declared myself an atheist on August of 2019, but I think that real like struggle where you're really like, oh my gosh, like nothing's making sense anymore, and you're digging through all the books and you're listening to the podcasts and all that started in about January of 2019.
Now, just a quick little backtrack on that. I know you've done entire shows on your deconstruction and deconversion, however you want to call it. I've even saw it pinned on your Twitter account today. It's a video to it. Because it kind of happened this way with me. I went in to the entire thing trying to understand it better. Like that was the whole process. Like I became interested in the religion because I wanted to understand the religion better. And once I dove into that, that's whenever I started taking those steps back. You know what I mean? And just was that the same kind of process you went through?
Definitely. So I started to like trying to figure out what was the right theology, like what was right, because I knew that I had come from a Pentecostal background, and I had moved away from that when I was about 20. And I guess, you know, really late, it's like 10 years plus later, I'm like, I think I should probably like look into that and like really think about why I don't go to a Pentecostal church anymore. kind of remember what sparked this, but not 100%, because it's always a couple things going on all at once, and all it takes is like that first question. So I think for me it was like I was having a conversation with my best rapture, and she's like, oh yeah, I've never really worried about that as much. And I'm like, what? You're not worried about the rapture? And so I think that was the first question that I started to look into, like, what is rapture theology? Where did that come from? Is it right? And that just starts like a whole snowball effect of like new questions. So I started out looking to figure out what was the right like doctrine to believe in. I knew that like some stuff I didn't really believe in anymore. It was no problem. I didn't believe in faith healing and that sort of thing anymore. But I wanted to know what was like the right theology, or what was the closest to first century Christianity. That was like in my head, that kind of question. And I mean, unfortunately, the more you dig into that, you realize that first century Christianity is also very diverse. And I spent a long time looking into that. And like, it's just never ending questions, right? Like I would kind of work through one thing and be like, okay, I think I have a good handle on this. And then like, countless nights I'm up trying to go to sleep, and I'm like, I have so many more questions. The questions never end. And it was like that for about 6 months. And that was the time that I had just like no filter. I was like talking to my husband every night. And I'm like, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And he was like, that's a lot.
Yeah. I think the closest I ever got. So whenever I started doing it, I dove back into learning, listening to stuff from rabbis and people, Old Testament scholars and things like that, because that's kind of what I wanted to do, because I wanted to kind of compare. I said, I want to understand where it started from, and that's where you go. And I remember one day halfway jokingly saying something to my wife, and I was like, if I could stop eating bacon, I'd probably become Jewish. And
I had that feeling too. I was really drawn into Judaism as well.
And that's kind of the first like hint that she got of anything. And she didn't even take that serious.
Yeah.
I
spent a lot of time listening to, like, I love that you had Rabbi Tovia Singer on recently, because like, I listened to so much of his stuff, because when you're looking into the idea of like, what was the original, the question of like, this comes up a lot. So you end up watching, you start going down that rabbit hole of like the historical Jesus, and like the debates between like, well, why don't the Jewish people believe that Jesus was the Messiah? And yeah, you kind of, if you start listening to like someone like Tovia Singer, like he's incredible to listen to. He's got the whole Bible memorized. And that brought a lot of clarity for me as well about like the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. And I definitely had that moment where I was like, well, if Judaism is true, then maybe I have been an idolater. Maybe I should, convert to Judaism. But along with all the other questions, you do obviously get into like the history of the Hebrew Bible as well. And I couldn't get on board with a lot of that as well.
Yeah, no, it's an important step. I mean, it's a big step. So I just kind of wanted to have that conversation, just so people out there listening could understand that it's something that we actually took some time to try to understand. It's not a decision you make overnight. So you're married to a guy who understands the Bible. I think you said he has a theology degree. So do you still get requests to go to church or to accompany him? Or
so I think one of the reasons why we have been successful, I will give my husband a lot of credit in this conversation as well, is that we saw problems in the church. So we had been attending church right up until basically or not quite. I guess we had kind of stopped going to church in 2019, but it wasn't like a conscious decision. We just that's kind of how we've always been. And I think a lot of couples are like that. We have kids. It's tough to go every week, but we always felt this little guilt about it, like that we just need to get there. But then we would go to church and we would get frustrated with the environment, So that's a conversation we've been having for years about like, they're, you know, they're not, the church is doing a few things that we don't agree with. Like we didn't agree with so much about like the presentation of the messages, and like it was an evangelical church that we went to. So some of the other stuff that we didn't find very, that kind of went against our value system together, was some of their views on like LGBTQ and those things. So to answer your question, not really right now, especially with COVID. There's just been no need. I think maybe I've lucked out that way, is that like the pressure is off in a lot of ways about going to church right now. I think where it will come up later in the future, it will be coming up to like the more of the festivities that happen at church, like the family days and they do like Easter events and like those kind of things. Those are where we've always gone to, especially with kids. Like we've always done that. So there is some conversation about like, what do we want to still expose our kids to? What are part of the community values that we still think are, worth attending? How do we present this to our kids? Like there's all those conversations going on. But
yeah, but I gotta tell you, I'm actually kind of glad that you and your husband are having these kind of conversations, because kind of with me and my wife, it's kind of been a situation where we've just cut like religious discussions out, because it's, it can cause arguments and stuff. And she's like, look, you believe what you believe. I believe what I believe. We're just going to leave it there.
Yeah. And so I do want to talk about that a little bit today, that like, when, if you're in a relationship where it's very, very, like that whole conversation is very, very touchy. There are some things that a lot of people will say, you have to create a boundary of like what you're going to push back on and what you're not going to push back on. And I've heard that a lot from people, that when it comes to your belief systems or your, like some people will just draw a boundary there and say like, we are married and we have all these other things that we work together with, but when it comes to like our religion, our belief system, there's got to be a boundary there, because it's hurtful to talk about it. So, and I totally get that. And even within my own relationship, even though we have a lot of open dialogue about it, there are certain things that I have made a decision to not talk to him about, because I know it's hurtful.
Yeah. And I mean, now you and I had a small talk about this like before we went on the air. So my wife and I have been together for 21 years. We've been married for 11. So I'm 37 now. We started dating around the age of 16. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been together, for this entire generation, I guess you could say, century. So there's just, and I mean, there's so much more things that we have in common that I don't see a point that you have to spend time like just nailing down on the few points where you have disagreements with your spouse.
Yeah, and that's a huge piece of advice for anybody going through like the shifting belief. It's easy to think of like, if we don't agree on our beliefs, then like we aren't compatible anymore. But it's really, I think, important to think about like what brought you together as a couple, and like all the things that you do have in common still, because I think especially for day-to-day life, and if you're married and you have kids, there is so many other little things that tie you together as a couple. There's so many other things that either have little or nothing to do with your belief system, that can really just keep you together. There's a lot of times there's history and there's memories and all these other things that can kind of rise above your religious beliefs, because but I understand also that that's not always the case for people, because your beliefs do inform a lot of your values. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, well, that's one of the and that's one of the good things that I have with my wife. Is my wife is I'm not going to say she's, some people might call her progressive Christian. I'm just going to call her, she's a 21st century Christian. She believes in rights for LGBTQ people. She has no issues as far as that goes. She's open to so much, because to her, being Christian it's about her faith, and it's a lot of it has to do with that's what she was raised in, and that's what her grandparents taught her, and her grandparents meant so much to her. And, you know, it's tied her family together.
Was she always like that? Did your deconstruction have any effect on her theology?
For the most part, she was. I guess church was a big deal to her. It hasn't been as much here after the last several years. So we got our kids. We found that we were looking for a church for a while. So we started going back to the church that I grew up in not too long before we got married, because she wanted to have a marriage inside a church. And she wanted it to be a church that she was a part of, and she knew the pastor and that kind of thing. And we went there for years, and we stopped going shortly after we moved, because when we moved and bought our first house as a family, we kind of moved further out, and it just became more. And like you were saying, it's one of those things. It's so easy to get out of that routine that it's, you know, and you're like, oh, I'll do it next weekend. I'll do it next Sunday. I'll do it the next event. I'll do it.
Did you, one other side question to that, like, did you and your wife feel like once you had kids, the pressure is increased exponentially to get to church?
No, I didn't. Well, so
I had that a lot. So like
my wife and I had our first child, and my daughter was born in 2007. We got married 2010. So my daughter was 2.5 whenever we got married.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, once we got married, we already had a child. A lot of her push to go to church was she had an elderly couple that helped raise her, because her mom worked nights, so she would spend a lot of time over there, and then they were going to church every Sunday. So it was always, we're going to church with them, and then we're going to their house for Sunday dinner after church, and it just became, you know, a routine, and that's kind of how it started. And then we just, it's that pattern thing. Once you're doing it, it's easy to stay in, and once you stop doing it, it's hard to keep going.
I think it's really extra hard for if you're like a young mom or a mom of young kids, and if you're staying home with them, or it doesn't even matter that actually, like, there's a huge kind of market at the church for moms of young children. They will offer a lot of programs to kind of bring your kids in. There's childcare, there's coffee and tea, there's connection with other moms. Like, that's a huge draw. And for me, that really did pull me back in. When my daughter was about 3 or 4, I started getting her involved in like the preschool programs and that sort of thing. And that really did pull me back into like an every weekend churchgoer for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And then I had my second, and then it got way harder.
Yeah, we were doing fine until we moved, and then it turned in from a 15-minute drive to about a 30-minute drive, and it just, and getting up. She always liked going to the I guess they call it the contemporary services with the live bands and, you know, dancing and stuff.
Yeah,
I preferred the traditional, like in the chapel, sitting down, preacher to the only one talking kind of thing. So.
See, and okay, so that brings up another thing that I think is interesting, is that when we call this like an interfaith relationship, in so many ways, I didn't realize until I started deconverting or deconstructing, was that I've always been in an interfaith relationship. Because when I met my husband, like, yeah, he's a Christian, I'm a Christian, like we are the same, but I think I was maybe somewhat naive still to think that we all Christians, that we have the same belief systems. So even throughout our relationship, because we were raised in different provinces and different churches, and he became a Christian as a teenager, I was raised in it. I think we actually always had different belief systems, but we never actually talked about a lot of the details about what our theology was. And during my deconstruction is when I brought up these things, and we realized that, like, even throughout this whole, decade that we've been together, we actually didn't have some of the same beliefs in the first place. So that obviously wasn't the glue that was holding us together necessarily. It wasn't the fact that we both believed in eternal conscious torment, or that the premillennial, that those kind of details that I was concerned about growing up. Those weren't a concern for him, because he had a different theology. The things that we did agree on were, the resurrection of Jesus, and an afterlife, and I would say those mere Christianity kind of things. So the conversation for us, it did actually bring up a lot of clarification about what we were both, where we were before all of this. And then as I kind of deconstructed, we kind of were able to talk about it throughout the way. And I think that one thing that did stir questions for him is he actually did end up challenging some of his beliefs about hell, and his view on the afterlife. So I would say that in some ways my deconstruction has caused his theology to shift a little bit. He would probably consider himself a universalist, and I have heard this a couple of times from other people too, that as when you have somebody who deconverts and you're a believer in hell, it can often cause people to reevaluate their view on hell. So in that way, it's been kind of good, I would say, because I think we were still able to have this conversation, and I still believe that he got to a point where he believes in a less harmful theology, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I can just let it go at this point, in a lot of ways. I can kind of let it go. You can believe that, that's fine. It doesn't actually, there's no conflict there for us.
Yeah. Well, and I know you kind of called it unequally yoked marriages whenever I was kind of putting it out there. I went strictly interfaith because I wasn't sure if your husband was a Christian or pagan or anything like that. Like, to me, growing up, it was Christianity, and then I get involved in some of these circles online, and I'm like, there's Greek pagans, Roman pagans, Norse pagans. There's ancient Jewish pagans. There's Canaanite pagans. There's
oh, really?
So,
I haven't talked to anybody who's considers himself a Canaanite pagan. That's really cool.
I usually get the questions at the end, but this is a nice guy.
That's okay. We can answer them as we go.
Yeah. Digital Hammurabi. Do you know who that guy is?
Yep.
He wants to know what kind of theological degree your husband has.
He, I think it's in biblical studies. I actually don't know what it would be called necessarily, but pastoral care. He did actually go to school to be a youth pastor, and he was a youth pastor for a time. And yeah, so I can't actually remember what the name of his degree was, but he knows a lot of theology, mostly in the kind of Baptist and Anabaptist filter, I guess. So he went to school, and he was taught about young Earth creationism and that sort of thing. But interestingly enough, as I was going through my deconstruction and I was badgering him with all my questions, they did teach a literal Adam and Eve and the flood and all that, but they didn't believe in he wasn't taught strictly eternal conscious torment, and a lot of the things that I would kind of pair together with that theology. So he's kind of has always had an eclectic Christianity.
He said cool things. I don't know if you watched it.
No problem.
But Josh guy, he don't know nothing about the Bible. So I heard you say that you had kids.
I do.
And I understand people having private lives off the internet. So please, as anything that you want to keep personal, keep personal. I'm not trying here to pry into anybody's life. So you said it's been about 2 years since you kind of deconstructed your faith. So I'm assuming you had both your kids at the time whenever this was going on. So how are you and your husband handling discussions as far as what you're bringing your children up in? If you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, I'll do my best here with keeping some things, I guess, within the family. But so I have a daughter who is 9, and I have a son who is 4.5. And so when I started my deconstruction, my daughter was 7. And if anybody's ever met a 7-year-old, like, they have a lot of questions too. So a part of my deconstruction actually was my daughter asking me questions that I didn't feel comfortable answering. Like, how does Jesus make people? She would ask, and I would say, I don't actually know how to answer that. So one thing that I have always done with my kids, and is even more so now, is just an open dialogue with these kind of things. So my husband, in a lot of ways, agrees with this, and he always has agreed with this, that we can't force our kids into any kind of particular belief system. And I think that's partly because he was raised in like kind of a general Christian family, but he didn't have like a personal salvation kind of testimony until he was 15 or 16. So he unlike my parents that thought that you needed to kind of like really, really press into this when you were kids, we have this idea with our kids that like we can't force them into anything. So we just have an open dialogue kind of conversation in our house. So when my daughter asks questions, we try to answer them to the best of our ability. I think some of the language for me has changed, where I will say, well, this is what, if you're a Christian, this is what you would kind of think about this. What do you think? I think that's a big question that is really important in our house, especially when it comes to questions like, what happens after we die, and these kind of things that I think my husband and I would both agree on, that no one knows for sure. And so even though I do have an opinion about it, I would just kind of turn it and say like, well, what do you think would happen? And she often talks about heaven and puppies and things like that in heaven. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Like, I'm not making any particular effort to be like, oh, well, you need to understand like what I believe about the brain and the soul or those kind of things. I just think it's much healthier to have an open dialogue about it and let her kind of discover these things. And when she's older and she has, more serious questions about it, like, give her all the options to look at. And my son, he's quite young still, so he doesn't think about these things yet. But yeah. So, and my husband, he still, encourages her, at nighttime if she's going to sleep. Like, we've always prayed with her, so we do still kind of do that as like a nighttime routine. We still pray with her. She does, for her, it's kind of just more of a routine thing. It doesn't go much deeper than that. I don't know. So there's still things that we'll see how it plays out in the future. But I think having that fundamental kind of agreement that we have like an open dialogue in us, and that we're not going to be dogmatic with her about what we think she should believe, is kind of the base that we were going with.
Yeah, see, I was kind of in I'm looking over here, I was pulling up this thing because I've got the actual like dates of when I started like.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's my pinned tweet, and it's just like my immediate family that I've told I don't believe in God, and it's got month and years. And,
oh, wow.
And so it was about 2017 towards the end of the year, whenever I told my wife. So just over 3 years ago. My daughter would have been 10 at the time. My son would have been 6. So
our kids are even the same age difference.
I was kind of in a completely different situation than you were in, because my daughter had been brought up in the church for 10 years to that point. My son had been brought up in the church for 6 years to that point. So, I mean, kind of, and kind of how I looked at it going forward was, personally, I think I had to understand that in my marriage, I was the one that changed. My marriage didn't change. I was the one that did. Mm-hmm. So kind of how I've always looked at it was, my kids were brought up Christian. I'm not going to attack them for being Christian. I'm not going to talk bad to them for being Christian. I'm not going to try to change them from being Christian. But I have kind of told my wife to the point where it's like, that's fine. If that's where they're going to be, that's where they're going to be. But if they come to me and ask me questions, hey, why don't you go to church? Hey, what do you think about this? What's this? Then I'm going to have to be honest with them, because that's just how it is. So, I mean, that's kind of the situation that I've kind of taken on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of agreement or boundary that you set there, right? With your kids. Like
Yeah,
it,
it's
it is really tricky when you've raised them in a certain thing and that's normal to them. And then you're totally right that when you go through this, you have to remember that you are the one that has changed, and it's not fair to your family to like push anyone else to come follow you in,
yeah,
your deconstruction of things, especially if they're not comfortable with it, or if it's just too much. So you have to really exercise a lot of patience with people
yeah.
when you've gone through a big change like that. I think that's a great policy, and just the policy of kind of honesty. So if they have questions, that you're going to try to answer it as honestly as you can.
So you think so you've had the luxury of COVID so far. Do you think once these lockdowns kind of change, you can be headed back to church on Sundays?
Um, this is a really tricky one for me because it's like I don't think so generally, but there's a part of me maybe with my like activism where I'm like, I would love to go back to like women's Bible study and sit there and like do SC on all the women. um, I think that there's a line that I would draw with this, because I do still see the value in like community stuff. So I think when it comes to like fun festivals and those kind of things, that the church we went to was really great about putting on like, these awesome kids things on the weekends and stuff. I think I would go back if it was just something like that, where it was a community building program. I have kind of made it known that like I don't want my kids going to I guess Sunday school type programs where they're going to be taught things that are not true, like about Adam and Eve and those kind of things. I think it'll have to be a discussion that comes up going forward. If my husband really, really wants to take them, then he can take them, but with the understanding that there needs to be a lot of protection there as well, and a lot of clear dialogue, because I have lost a lot of my faith or my trust in like the leaders in the church and what they're teaching my kids. I think the biggest thing that I look back on now is how much kind of blind trust I had in all the leaders in the church. And it's kind of a space where you think you can just come and drop your kids off, and that it's always going to turn out okay. And obviously that was a huge amount of naivety that I had about that. So even my daughter, at 6 and 7, she had questions because some of the stuff she was learning in Sunday school didn't line up with what she was learning even in school or just in books and that sort of thing, as far as like where to like evolution and those kind of questions that she had. Like those things were already causing her some stress because it wasn't lining up. So I don't know. The answer to your question is probably not, but I might make some exceptions.
Yeah, I kind of hold to some exceptions. Like I don't normally go even when my wife has went, but I do. She likes me to go with her on Mother's Day, and I say, okay, I'm not gonna. It's Mother's Day. I'm not gonna start an argument. I'm not gonna make it an issue. I mean, that's what it's about. Is you sacrifice for those. You know what I mean? Easter occasionally, like some Christmas events or whatever we go to. She takes them to all kinds of churches around Halloween for trunk or treats, and they're always doing things like
Yeah.
that. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's a compromise, and I think, like you were saying earlier, kind of one of the important things is you've got to kind of put up the boundaries and stick to them, because it works both ways, because once you start giving in, then the circle gets smaller and smaller, and then it gets to a point where you can't get those boundaries set back where they were.
Oh, I think we cut out there for a minute.
Oh, you kind of froze on me. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Could you hear me okay?
It kind of cut out for a second there.
Oh,
I heard
I'm
something
sorry, I was
about
just
the
talking about
circle.
yeah, no, it's just you build like the circle for boundaries, and you've got to
Yeah.
keep it intact, because once you start shrinking it or expanding
What about
it,
your extended? Yeah,
Um,
your extended family, because I think in my case, my kids are at higher risk of being taught things that I think are unhealthy from grandparents and extended family.
so neither me nor my wife have any grandparents left.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah.
my
What about your
mother-in-law,
parents?
my parents, my
That's who
mom.
I'm talking about. My
Oh,
it's my
okay.
kid's grandparents. So my mom and dad and that sort of
Well,
thing.
as far as my mom and dad, my dad doesn't go to church. He's still a big believer, and he was actually the very last one that I communicated to that I was not a believer anymore. As a matter of fact, I just pulled the tweet back up. It was 11:17. I talked to my wife about it. 7:19. I talked to my dad about it.
Wow.
My dad and I have always had a great relationship. My dad's probably one of my best friends in the world, but my dad is also, once my stepmother passed, my dad became more religious. And so just, we had some discussions about where him and I disagree. And finally I was like, you know what? I was like, let me just go ahead and be 100% honest with this guy.
That's really good. I haven't really even had that full on conversation with my parents, although they do know a lot. Something is definitely different now, but my parents are still very charismatic evangelicals, and especially I think with COVID hitting like that delayed that conversation by a lot because they're within the circles of people who deny COVID and have said don't get vaccines, and like it's been a whole different thing I wasn't even expecting when I deconverted and when I thought about having these conversations with my parents. And I think that in some ways I've kind of just wanted to keep that boundary up a little bit because I'm worried that my deconversion will kind of trigger them into a bit more of a panic about like the end times, and like that stuff's all very, very real to them. So my bigger boundary with my kids is exposure from my parents' churches, because I think like that's way more toxic than any church that like we had gone to. And I think the biggest thing there is just having, as my daughter is getting older, just talking to her about well, for one thing, just things like consent and those kind of things, even consent to conversations and stuff. So telling her that like if someone ever talks to you about something that's scary to you, like you don't have to listen to them. You don't have to sit through something with grandma and grandpa if it's making you upset or scary. And she has actually said a couple of times that like, I don't really want to go to, I don't really want to go to Sunday school with grandma anymore because it's kind of weird. And I'll be like, okay, that's fine. You don't have to go. But then other times, well, grandma's church is doing this other thing and it sounds fun. And I'm like, okay, well, you can, like giving her some agency there. It's a tricky conversation to have, but you gotta have them.
Yeah, no, as far as like church going, so my wife's mom doesn't really go to church, but she works most Sundays. My wife never knew her dad, so you don't have to worry about that. My mom lives 24-hour drive away.
That makes it a little easier.
and my dad lives about 10 minutes up the road. So my parents separated whenever I was about 3. So my dad lives about 10 minutes up the road, and he hardly goes to church either. But he's just kind of, oh, I'm praying more, I'm reading the Bible more, I'm doing that kind of stuff more. Mm-hmm. That's what you want to do, that's fine. We have discussions about it, and he asks me questions, and we get into arguments. But the great thing I like about my dad is him and I can get into a religious argument, and then it's okay. Well, I'm going to let you go because this is getting too heat. Okay, love you, bye, and and hang up, and then I'll go to his house 5 minutes later, and it's like the conversation never happened. So I mean, that's
amazing.
That's a great relationship to have.
That doesn't come as easily for a lot of people. Like it is very hard to have conversations with people when they identify so closely with their belief system, so that if you give any pushback, they do take, if they're going to take it personally, and then you kind of have to be at this like, you have to have the ability to recognize whether your pushback is going to be taken as just like we're just comparing ideas and beliefs, or whether your pushback is going to be taken as a very personal attack for the people, especially with family. Like I think I've discovered over the last year, like doing things like SE with your family is not as simple as doing SE with somebody on the internet or on the street. You have to use a lot more intuition about whether you're pushing back and it's going to hurt your relationship, or if you're pushing back and it's going to hurt them personally. It's a different ball game completely. So with my parents, I know that I could talk to some things, especially with my mom, about it, and she's gonna, we can have a little bit more conversation. With my dad, pushback is gonna be more hurtful for him. I think it's just maybe the kind of person that he is. So we just don't do that. I try to focus more on our relationship, and this goes back to like with the marriage thing. When you see something that's like a prickly area, you need to use some of humility, to like, I'm not going to make this making a mountain out of a molehill. Some things are not worth putting a stress on that relationship.
Yeah, my dad's a really rare breed because he's right-wing Christian, Republican, Trump supporter, but he hold on, because this is where the kicker is. Does not deny COVID at all. He's mask wearing every time he goes out. Hey.
Yeah. So, I feel like there are those people out there. They're not as outspoken on the internet as you find other people, but that's great.
He does deny climate change though, which he's not 100%.
Yeah, my parents do too.
So another thing I want to ask, because this is this kind of, it's not, like you were saying earlier, when you have a marriage, it's not just two people coming together. It's families coming together and becoming a larger group that interact. I'm sure. I don't know. So do you have any brothers or sisters, or does your husband have any brothers or sisters? Like I said, just as much as you want to get.
The only reason why I made that face is because my husband's actually one of 11 siblings.
Okay, my dad's the youngest of 13. So I can. That's my dad.
And my dad is the oldest of 11 siblings. So yeah, we come from very big families. I have older brothers. I have 4 older brothers. So yeah, there's lots of family, and there's a lot of different beliefs represented in there. Pretty well all of my family is evangelical, and most of his family, I would say, is actually, his family is a little bit more mixed because he didn't grow up in like evangelicalism. So a lot of them would identify as Christian, but they're just nominal Christians for the most part. And he actually, I discovered only very recently that one of his brothers is an atheist. So I didn't know that. He's been a secret atheist this whole time. So I'm going to have to call him up. But
there you go. Yeah. So I guess you're from Canada, so y'all do things a little different. Y'all have Thanksgiving on a weird day for some reason.
It's nice because it's not as close to like Halloween and Christmas. And
so I guess like how do y'all handle, like, I guess, is there like family prayer for family gatherings or things like that? How do you? Okay.
Yeah. So when it comes to like family prayer, so my family always grew up holding hands and praying before dinner, that sort of thing. Generally, if we're in their house, it's their rules. So if we're at their house, we will respect their wishes, and we'll hold hands and pray. And I've instructed my kids to do the same. Like my daughter has said a couple of times, like, it's kind of weird, like grandma and grandpa pray kind of, because they're, like I said, they're charismatic. So there's speaking in tongues and all sorts of stuff that goes on. So my daughter has been like, that's kind of weird, because we were just a little bit more like, and we've always been a little bit less charismatic than my parents are, because I said I left that when I was about 20. When it comes to our house, it's exactly the same thing. We don't pray, and so we don't pray before our meals. We don't do that thing. It's just about respecting whose house you're in and basing on that. And if like my parents want to like say a little prayer before they eat, like we're not going to be like, don't do that. You're in our house. Like they can do what they want. It's fine. There is a level of respect there.
Yeah, that's kind of the same way that I do. We don't really normally pray in my house. We didn't beforehand, but
Hmm.
my dad comes over usually at least once a week to have dinner with us. So he'll come over and have dinner, and he always sits down and he'll pray before he eats, and you know, and it's my dad, so I don't give a lot of pushback to him if he's like,
Hmm.
well, it's all. Occasionally, he's like, well, why don't we all say a prayer? And I'm like, okay, and
Yeah, I'm the
I mean,
same.
it takes me 30 seconds to bow my head. I mean,
Yep. Yep.
it's not a
So
huge inconvenience. I mean,
that when we had the last time we had my parents over for like a family dinner, my dad offered to pray, and so we just did. It's not a to me. I'm like it's just I don't believe anything's happening when we pray. So it's like literally all they're asking me to do is just close my eyes for a second and wait to dig into the food for another another minute. It's not a big deal, but it means a lot to them, so it's fine.
yep. All right, so well, I think we've been going for a little over 50 minutes. Do you have any questions for me? Because I mean, we've kind of been bouncing ideas off each other.
Um, hmm. Is your does your wife is she ever concerned about your kids like becoming atheists? Would that
I
be
don't know.
very hard?
I don't know. My wife's a weird one with that goes. I've had, and this is I'd put this on just my state having terrible school systems. Um, my wife and I have had arguments about whether or not humans are monkeys. So
Hmm.
that's you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's so much she she has worries of them becoming atheist as much as it is just I don't. And, I mean, I tell my daughter, she'll say something. I'm like, look, we're monkeys, and even her mom is a nurse, and I've had the conversation with her mom, and I'm like you can ask your grandma if you want to, because I mean, it's not even a discussion anymore. It's just a fact. So I mean, but no, if she does, she hasn't expressed it to me. Like I said, religion is just completely like left out for the most part in this household.
Yeah.
Um, I have religious conversations with my dad, and my wife just gets up and leaves the room. She's like, "Yep,
Hmm.
just not me."
Yeah, yeah. I that happens at my house a little bit too. If I'm having that conversation, he'll kind of just check out. He'll just go on his phone for a little bit because he's like, nah, I don't want to.
Yeah.
So
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I wish everybody could have the kind of household that Dr. Josh and Megan have, because
Mm.
apparently they discuss like 40 different religions like over dinner, and that's like 90% of their conversation is about deities from the
Mm.
world over. So I mean, can't all have it as great as they do.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's we do talk about religion a lot in here, but there's just has to have been some boundaries. So like the things that I think that like I know that my husband affirms belief in, um, those things are kind of off topic. But everything else is game. Like we can talk about the books of the New Testament and like where like all the different discussions going on there and what we think is like Pauline, authentic Pauline doctrine and or Pauline epistles and like those kind of things. Those kind of interesting conversations can come up and we can talk about it, no problem. Um, when it comes to like things like the resurrection of Jesus and like those things that I know we disagree on, or whether um, like the character of Jesus, like those things I know that like we can't really talk about because it's hurtful for him. So and it's not an important thing to do with our relationship. So those things are off the table. There's just a boundary there.
Yeah, I remember, and I remember it vaguely, so I don't remember exactly how it came about, but it was shortly after I talked to her about me no longer being a Christian. She kind of made the comment. She goes, "Well, she was like, who can I look to try to understand your, like, why you don't believe this stuff or whatever?" And I was like,
Who's your prophet?
yeah, not that. She was like, what kind of professor or something can I look to or whatever? And it was just the first thing that came to mind. I said, look, if you wanted to try try to understand the reasons that I don't believe, I was like, just look for Dr. Barter. She was like, oh, is he like, I was like, one of the biggest Bible scholars you're ever going to come across. She was like, well, for your side or my side? I was like, he's regarded by both sides as one of the best. So, I mean, just.
That's interesting because like that is one of the people that like my husband and I have sat down and watched debates from Barter. Like he also it's like he's like a safe character for us all to refer to in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Spartan had a tough question for you. He wanted to know if God does not exist and who is Jesus' dad.
Oh, that is a.
You're kind of begging the question that Jesus existed there, Spartan, aren't you?
Well, see, I have been listening to a fascinating podcast lately that is going to just blow up the whole question. Have you ever heard of Dragons in Genesis?
Mm-mm.
He was on Derek's Myth Vision not too long ago, and I started listening to the podcast, and it's wild. It's like a comparative mythology podcast, and it's so interesting. So it's like, was Yahweh even the father of Jesus, or was it El Young? We don't know. It's very interesting. Spartan got him.
Yeah, they it's weird. Like the more you look into ancient Judaism, is the more like you think.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Like, I mean, it's so ridiculous. Professor Francesca. I can never pronounce her last name.
Yeah, her last name's super hard. I know who you're talking about though. Yeah.
Just look at her stuff if you want to try to understand.
Yeah.
Judaism. And she's so she's just brilliant. So I mean, I'll watch anything I can find her on, just because she's got a British accent too, which makes it 100%.
Did you ever, during your deconstruction, I was surprised how many people did the same thing, but I watched the this is before I got like the Great Courses Plus, which is a great resource for anybody. But just on YouTube, there's like the Old Testament studies, Yale open sources from Christine Hayes.
I've watched some of them.
It's really, really long, and it's hard to get through at times. But that was like that, and then also the New Testament one by I can't remember his name, Dale something. Those were really, really interesting. Those sparked a lot of my interest. So even now that I'm an atheist, like I think so many atheists, like it's still so fascinating now, because it's like there's just a never-ending curiosity there about ancient history and ancient religions and all of it. It's still so interesting to listen to.
Hold on, I'm counting something real quick.
Yeah.
It's about 25. Dr. Josh sent me this. It's Old Testament Interpretations by John J. Collins, and it's his Yale Divinity like playlist or whatever. And I haven't got to it yet. I need to get to it, but that's something that's just sitting in my YouTube library. It's like, okay, this one's right here, so I can just do this one day.
Yeah, that kind of stuff never ceases to fascinate me now. And a lot of it I had to like go over and like kind of I had to, because it was a lot of the stuff that I learned over the last 2 years is so different from what you're raised with. Like, I've had to like listen to it, and like I've written notes, and then I've had to go back and listen to it again, and then finally I'm like, oh, okay, like this makes sense now. But there's always more questions.
Yeah, Spartan wants to know who's both your favorite Christians to listen/learn from. So that would be to both of us.
We could probably both answer at the same time.
I don't know if I'm doing a Christian to learn from. It depends. A lot of people that I liked, it's changed. I used to be a big fan of Lycona. I'm not so much anymore. Never really been a fan of Craig. Mm-hmm. Did enjoy some Dr. Brown for a little bit, and so much a fan of his anymore. I'd really have to think if I was going to narrow it down to a Christian, because
is this current? Like, who's your favorite current Christian? Spartan theology. He already knows my answer to this, but
oh yeah, what's your answer?
I am a big fan of John DePue and Laura Robinson. I do like God is Gray, Brenda from the channel God is Gray. So I'm obviously a big fan of people who are more liberal or progressive Christians. I love my Universalists. I think that they're like I often see myself more of as an ally with them. And this is one area that I do differ from a lot of other like activists. I can say that. I think that ultimately, like, I don't think I'm an anti-theist. A lot of people would consider themselves an anti-theist. I am against a lot of it, but I also find there's a good group of people that I find that our values and our goals in life, like the value system is so similar. And I think that if I was going to talk to somebody who still wanted to remain a Christian, I would love to see them move to a more progressive version of Christianity and stay a Christian. But I think that my goal here is to show the harm in like certain fundamentalist and dogmatic denominations and move people to a more healthy versions that I think that is more healthy for them in the community as well. So
I think a lot of Christianity is moving that direction.
I think so, and I think
overall.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Spartan's going to be mad at me here, but hey, man, if you got to keep changing your divine revelation in order to fit what it's supposed to be, it's not so divine. So.
And like, I do agree with you. Like, I do. Like, I if I believed it, I would be a progressive Christian, but I don't believe it, so I'm not. So obviously, when it comes down to like the nitty gritty, I don't agree with them, but I still like what they're doing, and I still think that they're overall a benefit to the conversation.
Yeah, see, the thing with me that's so hard to pull my favorite one is I pull so many pieces from different ones. Like I like some of the stuff that Ian Mills does, like the way his breakdown on like Matthew, and the synoptics. I like Laura, what she's doing. I like John. I had John on to interview him. I've done a couple open streams with John, on Spartan's channel. So I mean, I pull little bits from all of them, and that's kind of the thing, because I prefer like listening to somebody for like what their specialty is, kind of thing. And that's why it's so hard, because some days I want to talk about, some days I want to listen to universalisms. When I do, I go to universalist people. Some days I want to, do things with the resurrection. So I bounce to people who, spend their time on resurrection studies, and it's just.
Do I watch? Yeah, I do. I've listened. I guess I watch them now on YouTube too, but I've listened to Laura and Ian's podcast, the New Testament Review. Yeah, it's awesome. It's super interesting, and I think they do a really good job of like keeping that balance of being Christian themselves, but also like accurately representing the scholarship on New Testament studies. Yeah,
that's kind of my thing when it comes to that. Is I want to listen to the Christians that are following the scholarships on it, not the people.
I also really enjoy. I've spent good chunks of my time listening to John Dominic Crossan too, because I find him super interesting and kind of funny to listen to. Before I ever had heard of the New Testament Review, I spent a lot of time looking at the Jesus Seminar stuff and listening to the analysis from John Dominic Crossan. And I was introduced to that through a debate that he had done with Mike Licona. So I can see the progression of people I've listened to over the years. Like it's interesting.
Yeah, you start off with Hitchens and then you move towards like scholars.
Hitchens was Hitchens and Matt Dillahunty were just like shocks to my system. Like when I heard them, I'm like, I've never heard anybody talk about Christianity like that. And it's kind of interesting because like a lot of people, even though I personally take the view that like I'm gonna try to create allyship and advocacy, I still think there's a major value in people who are have like a strong rhetoric and can kind of use humor or shock value to break through some of that, because even though I can't do that, it doesn't feel right for me. That was a big part of me leaving, was hearing people talk like that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Mhm.
It's I kind of got thrown into it through the YouTube algorithm kind of thing,
Yeah.
and I mean, you talk about that was shocking. I went from having discussions with a buddy of mine that is a complete fundamentalist that believes in every conspiracy you can think of, um, kind of thing. Thinks the Illuminati's and the Jews are controlling the entire world, and that they work for Satan, and that even the reformation of Israel after World War II wasn't supposed to happen under wasn't decreed by God, but brought together by the Jewish Illuminati leaders to
Wow.
do all this. It's
I have
um,
people in my life that are like that too. Yeah.
and I went from talking to him to discussion to listening to debates about whether or not uh, whether or not the Trinity is biblical, to something else, and then like the next thing that the YouTube algorithm decided to throw me into was mysticism. So that was kind of
Oh, really?
I was like, wait a minute, this exists.
Hmm.
So that was kind of
Yeah.
a
I made a joke just yesterday, and I often say it, and it's like an expression in my household. We say "Praise be the algorithm," because it's like that is a huge part of it. Like I think my search started on probably more Google and like Reddit and Quora, and then books. But then the way that the algorithm works, if you start looking up that stuff, you're gonna get suggestions for other stuff.
oh yeah,
Oh,
it's crazy.
yeah.
So we've been going for just over an hour. I'm trying to see if we can have any more questions from the audience. I've kind of enjoyed having you on today, and looks like we kind of have the same principles for the most part as far as how to handle.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, like, there are people who have different ones.
Yeah, please. Or if anybody has any Spartan, I know you're not too far before you walk away from your Christianity. So if you know how to build barriers with your
He
wife
has
for the future.
babies on day. It's too much to ask right now.
No, I like Spartan. Spartan's actually from the same state as me, and that's
Oh,
kind of
really?
yeah. He's moved since then, but he was actually raised in the state that I was raised in. So I saw him on some dry apologist channels. I remember dry apologists used to have some open hangouts and kind of hit it off.
I'm gonna answer this question from Rodman Campbell.
Oh, I didn't even see that. I'm sorry. Sorry about
Um,
that, Robin.
so I was just recently recommended a book that I'm listening to right now, and it's really, really great. The book is called "Getting Relationships Right" by Melanie Joy, and it's a book about how to have conversations, how to have good boundaries, how to um, keep your relationship strong. It's I to be clear, I haven't finished it, but I am currently listening to that one right now.
And as far as me, I have not read any books lately on this topic. I am 100% terrible about reading. It is one of my least favorite things to do. That I have been begging to try to get some pushback from people on Twitter to help me out with that this year. I even
Oh,
put a
I've got lots of recommendations for you. I like to read and I also do audiobooks too. So like
I, I put a thing on Twitter just before New Year's, and I said, "Hey, I said anybody want to start like an internet book club headed into the new year?" I was like, "I
Mhm.
need something to kind of help me read," I got some likes and some retweets on it, and that was it. And then
Mhm.
3 weeks later, Spartan Theology is like, "Hey, we're having this new book club review where we've all read this book. Come join us." And I was like, "Nobody told me y'all were having a book club. I even tried to have a book club."
Yeah, I there is a lot of that starting right now too, like people starting book clubs, and I did join one. But like I'm really bad about reading on the schedule. Like I blitz through different books and I do it on my own time, and like I'm home with my kids for the most part, so sometimes it's audiobooks only. Sometimes it's like I'll sit down and read an entire book over a weekend. So it's really inconsistent. So I'm not a very good book club member as well. Did
Yeah, I
either
just
Oh,
we just
I did see Pine Creek's relationship advice. So a lot of people know me as a Pine Creek Creekster, if you will. We we don't agree on everything. Um, I don't know. I think Nathan and V are the cutest couple ever, though.
caught the last 10 minutes of it. That was Friday. I was coming back. I'm a truck driver, so I do a lot of driving. And
oh, you should be like all over the audiobooks then.
I should be, but
let me give you some recommendations after this. I'll give you several recommendations.
I usually spend all my time listening to irrelevant things like modern day debate. And
I have one other really good recommendation as far as books. One of the best books that I read last year. And like the author, again, I don't agree with everything because he whatever. But it's called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's probably one of the best books I've ever read as far as kind of getting into the mind of somebody who disagrees with you and why people disagree on things and what kind of things are pulling people to have certain positions. I felt like that book gave me a lot more empathy or like compassion to people who just flat out, I totally disagree with them. And has helped me a lot with my conversations and I kind of thinking about what's worth pushing back on and what isn't worth pushing back on. It was a really good book. So it's called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
I've heard that name a lot. There's a lot of people.
Yeah, and like he's a really good like psychologist or psychological researcher. He said a few things that like really grind the gears of atheists, but I mean he's not wrong on this book anyway. I don't think his research is solid about how people make their moral decisions and where do these things come from and why is it so hard for some people to see the other person's position. It's a really good book.
I think Craig Reed's a huge fan of Jonathan Haidt.
Well, yeah, of course, because he says something bad things about atheists. Jonathan Haidt doesn't think he's one of he's got a few opinions kind of sort of similar to Jordan Peterson about atheists. So he's another character that you can kind of both Christians and atheists have things that they can pull from his research, but
SJ says
he's an atheist, but he also has said a few things about, I can't even remember what it is now. I think Genetically Modified Skeptic does the breakdown of things that he has said that generally I would disagree with as well.
Well, welcome. Yeah, I started to stay in the chat. Welcome. I didn't even know she was here. Appreciate her stopping by. If you just got here to the tail end of this, we're going to wrap up soon. You can go back and replay it. It'll be on YouTube forever because
that's the thing about it.
So SJ, you got any questions since you just popped up in my chat? Yeah, she said she just got here. Yeah, please go back and rewatch it. Erin and I had a great conversation about how to handle some tough situations with your family whenever y'all are unequally yoked, as Paul would like to call it.
Yeah. I also find it really funny recently, and I think Doug from Pine Creek has started saying it too, which I think is hilarious, where it's like, when you're unequally yoked, some parts of the New Testament say not to do that, but then the other part, there's another verse that says that we're justified through our through our married spouses. So it's like, yeah, we're saved already anyway. We're justified through them. So that's funny.
I looked that up earlier in the stream. It's right here. 1 Corinthians 7:14. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So I think you and I are both safe either way.
Yeah, we're good to go.
That's good. So whether universalism is true or not, we still should be on the good side of it. All them bad atheists that marry atheists, they're all.
Yeah, if anything, don't be, or like anything, if anything, be unequally yoked as a measure, like kind of a Pascal's wager thing. So.
Yeah. I want to thank you for coming on and thank you for answering the tweet when I put it out.
Oh yeah.
I was trying to get Pine Creek on for this, but he never answers my tweets.
You can't make him do anything he doesn't want to do.
I couldn't even get a like or a reply from him whenever I tagged him.
Yeah, he's talked. He actually does have he has a couple of streams where he's talked about his relationship being married to a Christian. I think he even has one called Unequally Yoked. It's from a few years ago. And it is worth listening to for anybody who's in a relationship with somebody who would be still fit onto that more fundamentalist side as a spouse. I think that is actually a good resource to go watch. It's an older video.
Yeah, come check out this video first. And then
This one first. Absolutely. It's newer.
Video, you'll catch the recommendation.
This is fresher. It's newer. It's more relevant. But, you know, there is another one for after this one.
So, yeah, I think Pine Creek was who I was looking at for this originally. He wouldn't ever answer my questions. And like I said, I simply just threw a tweet out there into the void, and you kind of responded to it. And I was like, let's do that.
Well, I appreciate you asking the question too, because this isn't something like we've talked about. Like this isn't talked about a lot. Just like what is it like being not having the same views as your spouse? So, and I think more often than not, there's a change after, like you kind of get together as one thing. But I think if you look, if you kind of zoom out a little bit, that kind of happens in marriage all the time anyway. People change.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said about it.
Yeah, I mean, and real quick, I mean, that's kind of one of the conversations that I have with my wife whenever we were going through issues with some other things. And I was like, look, you're not the same person that I married, 8 years ago. But I was like, you don't do the exact same things. You don't do this. I was like, but I didn't marry you for that. I married you for who you are, not for these little tiny things. So, yeah. I mean, nobody's the same now that they were 10 years ago. So, I mean, even headed into a marriage, I mean, things are going to change. It's about putting them in the right perspective and whether or not you want those things to completely control, like, what you do with your life.
Yeah.
So, we're going to end on this one. Well, Erin, I want to thank you for coming by and spending a little over an hour with me.
All right, thank you.
Thanks to everybody that came by to check it out. Hopefully you got something from this, if nothing more than entertainment. Hopefully you actually learned something and let people know about this. Because like I said, I think this is actually a discussion that needs to happen that people need to check into. So
yeah, thanks for having me on. And if anybody has any other questions about this, you can always hit me up on my Twitter. I'm more than happy to have chats, and a lot of people will DM me just asking for some thoughts on things. That's fine. So,
and I do have a link to her Twitter account in the description of the video.
Perfect. So, cool.
All right. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and end this. Erin, please feel free to stick around for a moment. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining the show. I'm a YouTube newbie. I don't have any cool outro videos. So we're just gonna wave and stare blankly into a camera for 12 seconds.